So welcome everybody. We are going to start our seminar today with Noam Maeir, who is a PhD student at the Department of Comparative Religion and Digital Humanities at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He is interested in exploring the ways in which digital humanities can further traditional humanities questions, especially in regard to study Syriac Christianity, late antiquity, and also religion in general. The title of his PhD is still in the making, but we can say that it will be something like Syriac Christianity and late antiquity, digital philology studies. And in fact, today, Noam will speak of one of his central themes of research, which is the usage of Greek loanwords in Syriac. And so, Noam, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to the TeTra team for inviting me. And Dan, if it's okay, I will start sharing my presentation. So you can see, okay, great. So maybe let's begin with the overarching paradigm of Syriac-Greek literary interactions, which is seen in a Hellenization of Syriac literary culture. And I brought a quotation from Professor Brock's rather recent article. I should emphasize that I'm not using the term Hellenization in the sense of colonizing or a cultural takeover in which it has sometimes been employed. Rather, the term is used here in its purely descriptive sense to describe the phenomena of an ever-increasing incorporation and adaptation of elements from Greek literary culture into Syriac literary culture and language. So we're going to here be focused on the linguistic aspect of Hellenization, and we'll continue talking about this throughout the talk. And as far as the periodization of the Hellenization, it usually spans across late antiquity from the 4th to the 8th centuries. Now, as far as the data, that according to which there's a charting of Syriac-Greek literary interactions. Loanwords is one of those, among many others, such as grammatical replication, which is the use of grammatical structures with Syriac material, versus loanwords, which are Greek material. Translation techniques from target reader-oriented to text-oriented, shifts in genre, in tropes appearing in genres, shifts in theological discourse, etc. All these and more were used in order to, or not used, the description of their behavior seems to lend themselves to an interpretation of Hellenization. And so today we're just going to look at loanwords. This isn't an overall tackling of all these different phenomena. We're just going to look at loanwords. Now, studies of Greek loanwords have been pioneered by Professor Brock and Professor Butts, and they established a quantitative foundation, which is very important for me. And based on what their work, I'm able to further maybe this conversation. So the results of their analysis, or before the results, they collected 800 and more Greek loanwords from across different sources, and they analyzed, I'm calling it a pre-digital corpus, which we'll talk more about what that means, but for our purposes here, it means a limited amount of texts that a human can analyze. And they found an increasing influx of Greek loanwords during late antiquity. And well, the peaks change actually over the years. It depends when we'll look at the studies, but I think the recent peaks have been identified in the 6th century. And this was then understood as providing rather empirical foundation for Hellenization, a linguistic foundation. So before continuing, I just want to talk about loanwords more generally as a phenomena of linguistic contact, where in linguistic contact linguistics, borrowing is the transfer of any linguistic feature from one language to the other. And in that context, loanwords are lexical units or words that are transferred from a donor language, in our case, Greek, into the lexicon of a recipient language, Syriac. Now, there's an issue regarding loanword integration that I want to discuss. Loanword integration is the process whereby a foreign word, which is also called, in its most foreign format, it's a code switching. So the process whereby a code switch becomes a bona fide loanword. That's the process of loanword integration. And there's different markers or indicators of integration. One of them is when the foreign word appears in a monolingual setting. That's one marker. Another one is when recipient language morphosyntactic structures are applied to the loanword. So when Syriac structures are applied to Greek words, that would be a mark of integration. But the most important, or I think the most agreed upon feature in contact linguistics that marks integration is an increase in the frequency of a word. So the more a foreign word is used, the more we can say that it has become integrated into the language. And there are two hypotheses regarding this process of integration. The first one is the continuum hypothesis, which asserts that all foreign words have the inherent potential in becoming a loanword. And accordingly, the distinction between code switching and loanwords is not important, because when we encounter a code switch, it again is potentially a loanword. It's on the same continuum. So the distinction is not important. And as opposed to that, I'm calling it the differential hypothesis, that actually claims that the vast majority of the foreign words do not become loanwords. And so the distinction is important. A code switch is not a loanword. These are the two hypotheses regarding integration. But practically, it's impossible to distinguish based on frequency, especially in our pre-digital corpus. It's impossible to count all the appearances of a single Greek word in all the texts, available to us. It's practically impossible. It's not impossible if we had, a huge team working on this. But so what this means is that the previous studies had to rely on the continuum hypothesis by default, and that is code switches are understood to be a form of a loanword in the pre-digital setting. Now, this is where digital humanities comes into the picture. There's been various advances in the digital humanities relating to digitization processes, which especially are related to the construction of databases, which I'll present in a moment, and developments in what is being called distant reading, a humanities-oriented quantitative framework, which is basically a discussion or an attempt to incorporate quantitative analyses into humanities studies, which is something that is pre-digital, which again, Professor Brock is one of the pioneers in this setting. So these advances are result in an opportunity for us to redescribe the behavior of Greek loanwords according to the previously impossible distinction that was based on frequency. And that's one of the things that I'd like to show you. So first, let me present Sedra, a lexical database prepared by or Bet Marduto are the owners of this database. George Kiraz and his team worked very hard on tagging basically all the dictionaries and lexicons that we know or that we have, and taking each lexem or word in the dictionary and tagging it into the database. So there's 33 or almost 34,000 Syriac words on the database, and for each word, you see we have various information tagging. So we have like the source, from the various sources, lexical sources that mention, lexicographical sources that mention the word, and when relevant, also the etymology of a word was tagged. Now, thanks to this tagging of the etymologies, we're able to extract, all the words that have a Greek etymology. So from Sedra, I was able to extract almost 2,600 Greek foreign words or loan words. Now, the next database that we're going to use the list of Greek loanwords in is Simtho, which is another database by Bet Marduto and George Kiraz, which has many texts from many authors digitized into this database that includes 13 million words on it. And for each word, we have the various attestations of the word or appearances of the word in literature that has been digitized on Simtho. And for each word, we have, like you see here, the date, the text it comes from, and other metadata which could be of interest. So looking at the list of cross-referencing, between the list from Sedra and searching all those words on Simtho, first of all, we find that there's only 1,561 Greek loanwords on Simtho. So from the 2,600, there's 1,000 or so that haven't yet been found in the literature that was digitized. Their total mentions are 120,000 with the various forms or inflected forms of the words. And from these, 1,550 appear in dated texts. That is, we can date their appearances. There's 11 words that we cannot date them. And from these, we have 113,000 or so mentions are dated. So what this means is from that 13 million words on Simtho, 120,000 or so are Greek words. So it's about 1% of the corpus is Greek loanwords. So now for each word, for each Greek word, we have all its appearances and its dated appearances, so that we can also extract the first mention, the first time each word is found. So let's look just how the analysis of the loanword influx looks when we take the continuum hypothesis as our point of departure. And that means we don't distinguish between code switches and loanwords. So this is a diachronic analysis of the first mentions of Greek words. So you see that the 4th century has almost 300 new Greek words mentioned. The 6th century has 270 or so. And surprising or unsurprisingly, depends for who, the 10th century, has almost 600 new foreign words, new Greek foreign words appearing, which again, if we don't distinguish code switches from loanwords, this is the picture, this is the image. So what we see is, first of all, the 4th century is higher than the 6th century, which is something that is surprising to some degree. The 10th century is the absolute peak. And as far as the periodization, you see that it spans all the way to the 13th century and even beyond. It trickles even in the 21st century, having a new Greek loanword appearing. So we could ask a question about Hellenization in late antiquity from these results. I don't want to yet discuss that. We'll return to it, but another issue that arises is the coherence of the continuum hypothesis in this regard. So let's look more at the influx if we take the differential hypothesis as our departure point. So I divided the words based on their frequency into 4 groups. Words that were mentioned 1 to 10 times, words that were mentioned 11 to 100 times, words that were mentioned 100 to 1,000 times, and words mentioned 1,000 to 10,000 times. Okay, that's the groupings for the loanword. So you see that there's more than 1,000 words are mentioned 1 to 10 times. 200, and something words are mentioned 11 to 100 times. 100 to 1,000, we have 140 or so. And there's 18 words that are mentioned 1,000 to 10,000 times. Now you see that the number of mentions, for each group, you see that the total mentions are very high. It's almost a mirror image of the mentions per loanword. So what that means is, that the frequency, first of all, is distributed in an uneven manner, which means that the vast majority of the words, 90% of the words, appear very little. So 10% of that corpus of Syriac, of Greek words, 120,000 words we have, only 10% of it relates to 90% of the words, and a small group of words, 10% of the words, account for 90% of the Greek loanwords appearances. The top 1%, those 18 words that were mentioned between 1,000 to 10,000 times, they account for 50% of all Greek loanword appearances, which is remarkable to some extent. So now this was just a look at frequency without a diachronic perspective. Let's add the historical dimension to see how each group behaves. So you see that we said, 1,130 words mentioned 1 to 10 times. This is how they distribute historically. And here you see that actually between the 4th to the 8th century, the 6th century is the peak. So, but still we have the 10th century standing out there. So there is some pattern of increase, perhaps one can say, in this group of words. But now look at what happens when you go higher up. So the group of words that were mentioned between 11 to 100 times, 250 words or so, you see the 4th century here is the peak, with a rather almost linear decrease, right? Until the 10th century, and with a small gap, and then the 13th century, a small mention. Now look what happens when we go even further up in the mentions. So words that were mentioned 100 to 1,000 times, 145 words, entered again, most of them in the 4th century, a few in the 5th century, and even fewer in the 6th century. Of course, a pattern of decrease is seen. And when we look at those 18 words that account for 50%, they all appear by the 4th century. Okay, so what I would say, point out here, is that first of all, the more frequent a word, the earlier it seems to have entered. All the most frequent words appear by the 4th century. And each group has a different periodization, right? We have the 4th century, the 4th to the 6th century, right? We saw till the 13th century, and then we saw all the way to the 21st century. But it is important to also note that the top 3 groups do display a pattern of decrease from 11 to 10,000 mentions. So all the words mentioned 11 to 10,000 times, their influx displays a decrease, which definitely raises a question regarding Hellenization. But instead of, Hellenization basically assumes, or it doesn't assume, Hellenization is the increase in Greek assimilation of Syriac assimilation of various features. So in the case of the linguistic features we're looking at, we don't see an increase, rather mostly a decrease. But I would argue that there are 2 different kinds of processes or Syriac-Greek interactions that we can see here. The first is the one that it relates to the lexical borrowing of Greek loanwords, which we saw is happens on a very limited time frame from the 4th to the 6th century, with the majority of the words appearing by the 4th century peak. And the 18 most frequent loanwords, I wanted to show them to you. I marked in red the words, and an asterisk, the words that have been, that appear in pre-Syriac Aramaic documents. So that is that they don't reflect contact of Syriac and Greek, they rather reflect Aramaic and Greek interactions. But so there's really 13 new words that appear in Syriac. And for the most part, Usia, prosopon, episkopos, kephalion, evangelion, agono, Christiono, Alexandria, Rome. These words, I would say, it's not essential for my point, but I would say that they mostly attest to the Christian context of the contact. Now, the second process I would mention, aside from the loanword borrowing, we have just local usages, that are seen through the appearance of infrequent Greek foreign words. And this is witnessed throughout the history of Syriac literature. It's not delimited to a specific point in time, but rather, from above, we see it appearing throughout. So what I would say is that the influx of loanwords, that process that is from the 4th to the 6th century, does not support the interpretation of a gradual Hellenization, because there's a decrease in the influx of loanwords. And it does not support the periodization also of late antiquity, in the sense that the periodization helps to delimit the phenomena, right? As far as the 8th century goes, it isn't helpful in that sense. We'll come back to this. And as far as the influx of code switches, I would say it does not attest to the assimilation of Greek language, right? The very nature of these words is that they are infrequent. So I don't think, based on frequency, it's hard to argue that these words are assimilated into Syriac language. And more than an assimilation, I think it attests to the various local contexts and the agencies, the Syriac agencies, that prompted, or that made coherent using the Greek words. And as far as contact linguistics are concerned, which is not our concern here, but the differential hypothesis seems to offer a much more coherent picture of the data. So I think there's some support to this hypothesis is given here, and which will be interesting, I think, for contact linguists. The final conclusion, perhaps. So what does this mean about the Hellenization paradigm? Of course, this doesn't, like we said, we saw there's many literary phenomena that their description does lend itself to an interpretation of the Hellenization of Syriac culture. But as far as the linguistic foundation provided by loanword influx and code switch influx, I think now we can, I would argue that that doesn't support this interpretation anymore. And as far as the periodization of late antiquity goes, again, I wouldn't say, I'm not arguing against that periodization, but in the sense that periodization helps you distinguish between phenomena from both sides of, the periodization, that where a process ends and where the next process begins. So the periodization of late antiquity until the 8th century is not useful in knowing until when loanwords enter, or when do they stop entering, and it doesn't help us regarding the code switches. So rather, I would say either the 6th century, 4th to 6th century is relevant, and then maybe 4th to the 10th century or 13th century. So as far as, did I run through it? No, I'm doing good with time. As far as the digital humanities, where we were talking about advances in digitization. So usually digitization, is associated with just quantity, which is true. We have more texts, we have hundreds of texts now, as opposed to the pre-digital corpus. Like I remember Professor Butts in his study analyzed 12 texts. A human can handle that, but digitization brings us to a higher level. But more than just adding texts, it also adds features. It adds criteria that we can analyze data by, and that is frequency in our case here. But of course, there are other features can be added. So pre-digital, we couldn't analyze frequency, and so that produced a certain picture that did seem to support an increase. Once frequency is possible to analyze, the picture changes. And another aspect of digitization is the systematic combination of data from different sources, which is the crossing between Sedra and Simtho in our case. But you recall also that there were 800 loanwords collected from various sources. So here, we didn't have to collect from various sources. Sedra provided us with a comprehensive and extensive framework, and we could just simply transfer from one to Simtho and get new interesting results. And like I mentioned, the humanities-oriented quantitative framework that is getting us used to or developing a humanities studies, feeling comfortable with quantitative analysis. So all of these developments, I think, open for us the potential to redescribe our data, to retest foundational cultural and historical paradigms, and I think holds, as we saw for loanwords, but has the potential to shed light on other such phenomena. And there's limitations that we can talk about. I think let's stop here. And we can talk further maybe in the questions.
Thank you very much, Noam. That's a fascinating talk. I'm pretty sure we can talk more about this now. So if you have any questions, feel free to raise your digital hand or put them in the chat if you're not able to speak. Let me maybe start off with one question, which is, in your research, do you distinguish somehow between Syriac texts that are translated from Greek and the ones that aren't? Where, of course, if you, in certain translations, you would just keep the Syriac, well, the Syriac transliteration of a Greek word. And what does that say about these kind of words being still foreign words or not, or loan words already? And how does that impact your research?
That's a good question. Well, on the level of this analysis, which is, looking really at the big picture, I'm not distinguishing between translations and original text. I know Professor Butts, his study does, distinguish between the two, but there is, I think, a common understanding that often the first mention of, a Greek foreign word or loan word is found in the translations, and then becomes incorporated later, perhaps in original writings as well. So that could also maybe be understood as the bilingual context moving into monolingual context. Maybe that's I hope that answers.
Okay. Georgia has a question first, and after that, Albert. Yes, I see. Okay. Georgia, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I was triggered by the last slide you showed, the very last one, because my question is, well, first of all, thank you. It was fascinating indeed. Are you only considering nouns or also particles? Because I was a bit surprised noticing that 18 was common words, like what we would expect, like get
and then, yes, of course. So, well, if you let me share again, and I'll take you to the limitations in general. So you see what, as far as limitations go, first of all, of course, we have undated texts. We have, still many texts and manuscripts that have not been digitized. Now, as far as the nature of the current, version of Simtho, doesn't have morphosyntactic tags. So I'm not able to distinguish when men is men or when is it from, so just men in itself, or the letters mem nun, they just on its own has 200,000 mentions, which is more than the entire corpus of Syriac mentions. So I had to take out something like 17 words that were those kind of words that grabbed a little more or much more than what you would assume. And that is part of the limitations. And I would assume that as the database improves with its tagging, so we'd be able to distinguish, between the different appearances. So you're right, though, they would be added. You would add, there would be a few particles or a few more words that we would add into there.
Yeah, of course. No, it's very complicated to distinguish. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Of course.
Okay, Albert, go ahead.
Yes, I had a question. Thank you for your presentation. Should you not take into account the authority of a text? So in the 4th century, I guess, the Bible was translated, and therefore the number of frequency of loan words, perhaps, as an example. Do you understand?
I'm sorry, no, I didn't understand the question exactly.
Should you not make weight the authority of a text to take that in account for the frequency of occurring a loan word?
So if I understand, you mean
the Bible is more authoritative than an older text, I suppose, and Ephraim more than another, perhaps.
Authoritative, that's the word. So yeah, that could be that could be a distinction that one makes here. I'm not I'm not concerned with identifying the specific text from which a loan word comes from, but one can do that. I think part of distant reading, as a quantitative method, assumes that it can't see the local context, in which a word appears. When we're looking from such a high perspective, I'm not able to assess those things. But there would be an interesting addition, I think.
Okay, thank you. Anyway.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Valentina is next.
Yes, thanks. Maybe you answered partially already to my questions, answering to Albert's one. So basically, I was wondering if you consider also the kind of literature. For instance, when I saw your Loanwords, there was Piazza from Peso, and in Isaac it's very frequent. And it is there, of course, already in the Peshitta to translate hypothesis and plerophoria, but I guess maybe in the aesthetic literature would be more present. So I wonder if you also differentiate like a scientific literature, but maybe it's a too close perspective, which differs from the one you adopt.
Right, exactly. And I think also the nature of the texts that we digitize, of course, also influences. I think, a lot of the texts are ascetic to some degree, because they're mostly produced in monastic contexts. But yes, it's not. I mean, these are all things that maybe further studies can focus on, or other doctorates maybe.
Thank you.
I would say maybe that this also covers Mikael's question, which he puts in this chat, which is, do you distinguish between loanwords and technical terms? I think that more or less, unless you want to. Okay, Boško.
Thank you for the interesting lecture. You mentioned loanwords from before the 4th century. How sure is it possible to be that some of the words were not used in Edessa in the 2nd or 3rd century, and maybe even before that? The answer to this question significantly changes the view on the number of the new loan words in the 4th century. Maybe Hellenization was more gradual in that period. Thank you.
So, I think I understood what you're saying. I mentioned that by the 4th century we have all these words attested, and the reason for that is exactly as you say. There might be earlier Syriac documents that we haven't, we don't have either access to or haven't been transcribed or haven't been digitized, that will show that it was even earlier, that the Hellenization was even earlier. So the 4th century could only be pushed back in this case. We wouldn't go forward, but exactly.
Thank you.
I see Professor Brock has a question. I'm super honored to have him here and asking questions.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. First of all, on Simtho, it's an immensely useful tool. There's going to be a new edition with a lot more text going to be released fairly soon. And this, I guess, may change your numbers quite radically, because the less accessible text will now become more accessible. One warning, I found using Simtho that quite a lot of things are actually duplicated, so you get the same entry listed twice in different places on the screen. So that's going to affect the numbers quite badly. what surprised me most was the 10th century. And one wonders what is the cause. Of course, there were some very important writers then, but I find that quite extraordinary.
Mm-hmm.
And also many of these 10th century writers haven't yet been published properly.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another puzzle.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The one thing that sort of your findings go against mine is I've tended to work author by author. And certainly my pattern of Hellenization fits my way of working. Obviously, it doesn't fit your way of working. I don't know how one sort of makes the two meet. I think it's very important to distinguish, and Aaron Butts, if I remember rightly, does this very clearly in his wonderful book, between code switches and loanwords. However, those loanwords may have come about. They may have, of course, started as code switches.
Mm-hmm.
But especially in the 6th century, you have a great number of Greek titles, officials and so on, many of them, in fact, of Latin origin too. And they will disappear when the contact with the Byzantine, with the late Roman Empire disappears.
Mm-hmm.
So that these are only temporary. And indeed, I suspect that quite a number of the words that you have in your 4th century list, which I suppose represents the basic body of loanwords that are already present by, or certainly by the 4th century, and then that gets built on. And some of those will disappear in later writers. It's actually very difficult to trace the disappearance of these things, but that's something to take into account. Another thing that eventually needs to be taken into account is how they are treated. You rightly mentioned the cases where Syriac word morphology is applied to Greek words like texon becoming takes and so on.
Mm-hmm.
The number of words in that category is relatively small, but it's obviously an extremely important one. And then the way these secondary formations are sort of built up, that too, I think, can be chronologically followed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that is something I'm quite interested in, but I haven't written anything on it.
Mm-hmm.
So anyhow, I think yours is a very interesting approach. Looking at what's on the screen just now, I would exclude things like Alexandria. I don't think that's helpful.
Right.
But the others, I'm surprised by Xenia. It becomes common. This is a case actually where Simtho is difficult to use unless you vocalize it, because Xenia is Axenia, which in my just offhand, I would say is a late 5th or more probably a 6th century thing, whereas Axenoio, which is spelt exactly the same, is much earlier. So I think there are lots of problems of details like that that need to be taken into account.
Mm-hmm.
But anyhow, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your comments. Well, I would, there are a few things you said that I found very interesting. Well, first of all, as far as the data, I think that's part of, you were talking about your way of the findings that you've seen in specific authors. So I think that precisely the difference between pre-digital and digital is seen there. Like there's the data itself performs some sort of paradigm. So when the data is looked at through a human lens, so we're not able to appreciate frequency. So there is that picture emerging, but once frequency can be taken into consideration, that's what we see. As far as the 10th century, I would say that first of all, in the context of the translation movement, there is some logic to seeing many code switches appearing there, and which aren't fundamental to the Syriac language, but they're part of text appearing there. And I would say that Aaron Butts in his book knows that code switches and loanwords are different, but he actually explicitly says that he cannot distinguish them, and that he will assume that a code switch is a loanword. So I think that is the essence of the difference between your findings and these findings, is the ability to incorporate frequency into them. I don't remember, there were a few other things you said that I found fascinating, but in the recording, I'll go back to them.
Okay, Michael, I think we sort of answered your question before, but do you want to ask something else more specifically, or are you happy with the answer?
Well, I'm quite happy with the answer. I was just thinking about what a loanword really is, because you have to look at the texts, I guess, in scientific texts. Maybe they use much more Greek words, like in as technical terms, like this, but they are loanwords as well. So perhaps you should make clear what a loanword really is, to have a more precise idea of what you are looking for. But I thought your lecture was really very, very interesting, and I didn't expect such an approach. So I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, I know this is not the common research for TeTra, but instead of textual transmission, maybe this could be word transmission. I did recall now that Professor Brock, you mentioned the morpho-syntactic structures. So I would say that, first of all, as far as contact linguists go, the morpho-syntactic structures there is an argument that is not a gradual process, but rather something that could appear at the very beginning of a loanword or a code switch appearance, meaning bilingual people could often use a code switch already integrated with morpho-syntactic structure. So there's some argument regarding this, but in any case, I would be extremely interested as well, and I've thought of this, to try to trace the historical change of, because we could basically give some answer to this hypothesis regarding the morphosyntactic structures, for instance, by showing that it happens later or earlier than one would expect. Increase of frequency is what is most agreed upon as far as the characteristics of a loanword. That was what I recalled suddenly. Sorry.
Okay. Any more questions? Raise your hand. Last chance. All right. Then this leaves me to thank our speaker, Noam, for a wonderful talk, and thank you all for joining us. And we will see you next time.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Bye, everyone.
There was one thing I was hoping to show you.
Go ahead.
I think will be of interest to, you mentioned that the rest of my studies, have something to do with digital philology, so to speak. So other projects that I'm doing involve, one of them is analysis of rights catalog in the British Library to try to get some sort of measurement of the excerpts, a scribal excerpting technique, which is based on the digitization, again, of the catalog by Professor Michelson. And aside from that, I'm interested in, I'm building on George Kiraz's, the models, the handwritten text recognition models that they use in order to, first of all, identify rubricated texts. I'm interested in trying to textualize, so to speak, rubricated text, as they're usually not included or not included in a formal way in textual editions. And you'll see that I've trained I've used George's algorithm as a base, but I've trained a model that could read pretty well, is identified in Syriac in manuscript. This is the results, here on the side that you could see the results of the handwritten text recognition. And I think this will be potentially useful for, many scholars. So I need to make this available, make it public, but this is happening. I wanted to show, and if anybody's interested in that, I'm happy to try to make it work better.
Certainly for the part about excerpting certain authors, it might be worth getting in touch with Emiliano Fiori, whose
Yes,
project,
of course, I've spoken to him, of course.
of course, yeah. Looks fascinating.
Yeah, so here I have, a model that knows, like you could give it a manuscript and it, cuts out all the rubricated text. You see, it identifies the rubricated texts. Anyways, yeah, that was, just before we go, throw it out there.
We'll have you back at some point talking about this. Thanks very much. Your work looks very exciting. We're looking forward to publications. Thanks everyone for joining us. Have a nice day. See you next time.
See you next time.
Good seeing everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.